Hello, everyone. This week, the topic focuses on sampling techniques. So first, let me ask you a question. What is a sample? A sample is a group of people chosen to represent a larger group of people. So let's take a look at the different sampling techniques or methods that you can use in different types of research studies. The learning objectives for this lecture is to explain the relative importance of sampling in quantitative and qualitative studies, differentiate between various probability sampling techniques, recognizing the strengths and weakness of each, and compare different non-probability sampling techniques and recognize situations in which these techniques are appropriate and analyze the needs of a research study in order to select the most appropriate research or sampling techniques. So first, let's go over some terminology. Again, well, first, as I mentioned, a sample is a group of people chosen to represent a group of people. What is a case? A case is a basic unit of analysis. It is the term used to refer to different units of analysis, including, for example, an individual, a family, a group, organization, community, or even a nation. And I apologize. So let's take a look here. Universal theoretical population and accessible population. What is the difference? So the universal population, for example, is all women in the US. The population of interest is probably 1,000 women in the clinic. But the sample, so we're not interviewing or we're not conducting a survey on all the 1,000 women in that clinic, but we're only choosing 200 of the 1,000 women as part of the sample for a study. And here, also, the population may be defined as all the BSW and MSW students at an MSU. But the sample is chosen from the entire population of BSW and MSW students. So not all BSW and MSW students are participating. The sampling frame is a list of potential cases from which the sample is drawn, but not everyone in the sampling frame will participate. So the sample is the final list of participants who were part of the study. So in other words, a sample is a subset of cases selected for study from among people or objects within a population with defined or specific characteristics that you are looking for your study. Representativeness, it refers to the degree to which a research sample is similar to the population from which it was drawn. So thus, representativeness should be regarded as a relative term. So ideally, we would like to study cases that are identical in all respects to the members of the population from which they were selected. But of course, the only way to do that is if we do not sample at all, but study the entire population instead. But if we did that, the major benefit of sampling would be lost. Fortunately, perfect representativeness in every respect within a sample is not really necessary. A sample can be sufficiently representative of a population if it resembles a population as a whole with respect to a limited number of relevant variables, most often the dependent and independent and any potentially confounding variables. So the sample size, again, so how many people do we need to be part of our study? So the larger the size, the more likely it is representative. So there are two principles that we need to take into consideration because for some types of study, as we have said before, so for example, for some types of qualitative studies, we don't need to have larger or as large samples as, for example, for quantitative studies. So one of the principles is the size of population from which the sample was drawn and the level of variability in the population. And we also need to consider the statistical analysis for which it will be used. So I will talk a little bit about it also later. So again, if we are not conducting a statistical test to test the association between different variables, we may not need such a large sample. And also, depending on whether our study is focusing on a more specific population, we may not need a population that represents, or a sample, I'm sorry, that represents the entire population. So there are, another term that you will hear is random selection and random assignment. So what random selection is referring to is when all the cases have equal probability of being selected from the population, and this enhances the sample representativeness. So that's there in the first step. And in the second step, random placement it refers to random placement in experimental conditions. So people have the equal chance of being placed in either the control group or the treatment group. So random selection entails drawing the cases for a sample or subsample so that all cases have an equal probability of being selected. It is designed to preclude sampling bias. And again, random selection should not be confused with random assignment because these two terms can be confusing. As we already mentioned, random selection is a process of randomly selecting cases from the population so that our sample is believed to be roughly equivalent to the larger population in relation to all variables of interest. And random assignment is the process of randomly assigning the cases to subgroups after they are selected for your sample. So when selecting a good sample, this is some advice that you should take into consideration. The availability of resources for securing the sample. The larger the sample, the more resources that you will need. And you also need to take into consideration the overall design and purpose of the study. And that will also dictate your sampling needs. The type of statistical analysis utilized may also dictate the size of the sample and sampling method. So again, if you need to have a very a strong statistical power, and also if you need to analyze the relationship between different variables, you may need a larger sample size and also a more rigorous sampling technique, such as random sampling or some type of probability sampling that we will discuss in a little bit. Also, relative importance of sample representativeness. Again, qualitative versus quantitative. For quantitative studies, you tend to need more of the probability sampling methods. And for qualitative studies, you tend to use more of the non-probability sampling methods because of the difference and the reasoning behind why you conduct qualitative study and why you conduct quantitative. So one of the types of sampling methods, it's called probability sampling. And these type of methods refers to the selection of a sample from a population when this selection is based on the principle of randomization, that is random selection or chance. Probability sampling is more complex, more time consuming, and usually more costly than non-probability sampling. So let's take a look at the different types of random or probability sampling techniques. One of the methods, it's called simple random sampling, and it entails selecting a predetermined number of cases from the sampling frame or population. So for smaller populations, you can draw cases from a container, for example, with index cards, identifying each member of the population. So for example, in a classroom, you would put the names of all the possible members and everyone would have the same chance of getting selected. For drawing larger populations, you can use a table or computer-generated list of mathematically generated random numbers to assist in the selection of cases. Sample random sampling is the most well-known type of probability sampling. It entails randomly selecting a predetermined number of cases from the sampling framework or population. If we wanted to select, for example, a 25% sample or 25 people from a sampling frame of 100 people, we could write each person's name on the individual card and randomly select 25 cards from a container. Systematic random sampling. So first, you compute the necessary interval determined by dividing the number of cases in the sampling frame or population by the number of cases needed for the sample. So for example, if we only want half of the population to be in the sample, we could select every other person. If we only want a third of the population, we can pick every third person, and for a quarter every fourth person, or for a fifth every fifth person. The disadvantage is that everyone does not have the same chance of being selected. If we are selecting every other person, starting with the second person, we select every fourth, sixth. So this means that the third, fifth, for example, never get a chance to get selected. Stratify random sampling. It reduces the amount of sampling error and ensures enough cases within different values or value label categories of a variable for comparison purposes. So you would divide the population into homogeneous categories or strata based on variables of interest, for example, gender, race, or profession. And second, the desired number of cases is selected from each strata by simply random sampling or systematic random sampling. So again, for example, you could have people divide up people according to categories such as social workers, physicians, so by their profession, or also it could be by gender. And in the second step, you would select from those group using that using using random sampling or systematic random sampling. And cluster sampling, it involves a multi-stage process more likely to be used in large-scale surveys or studies that involve cases that are geographically distant from each other. So first, we identify a cluster of cases. Then we randomly select a predetermined number of clusters, and all cases within each of the selected cluster is selected to constitute the research sample. So for example, we need a random sample of people experiencing homelessness, but it will be hard to come up with a list of all people. So we need to gather a list of all the shelters in the area, and each shelter is a cluster of cases. Then within that cluster, we do random sample. Then shelters are selected. And we randomly select people within those shelters. So let's go on to non-probability sampling. So non-probability sampling can be used when random sampling is not possible, when there is no population list or sampling frame, when it's not possible to have a sampling frame, or you decide that the type of research that you're doing, it is less necessary or less important to have representativeness. So this is a method that does not use random selection. So the first type of technique with a non-probability sampling, it's called convenience, or also sometimes availability or accidental sampling. And it entails selecting cases for study primarily because they happen to be readily accessible to the researcher. Again, it is also called accidental sampling. And it may produce an acceptable level of representativeness, but it is a method that is probably the least likely to do so. So for example, maybe sometimes our clients may be readily available, or for me as a professor, my students may be readily available. So that would be a convenience sample because that population is readily or conveniently accessible to us as a researcher. Purposive sampling. In this type of sampling, cases are selected because researchers believe that the cases can provide them with access to a unique approach to a problem or situation, or a special perspective, insight, expertise, experience, characteristics, or condition that they wish to understand. It is used in research in which again, it might be preferable in which, for example, you already know that you need to talk to a specific type of experts, or because they have a specific type of expertise. It's a typical or atypical group. So for example, I only want to talk to, recently I mentioned that we conducted a study on the perspective of community agency leaders and government leaders on the access that immigrant families have to different services in Doña Ana County. So we specifically selected different agencies from Doña Ana County that we knew could provide us this perspective on immigrant families. So that is an example. Snowball sampling. So first, one or just a few people are identified as potential research participants, and they are asked to provide the names of people they know or know about who, like themselves, have experienced a problem or who in other ways meet the necessary criteria for inclusion in the research study. And the next potential participants are contacted to determine whether they are eligible for inclusion in the sample, and if so, whether they are willing to participate in the study. They may in turn be asked to provide the names of other potential participants. The process is repeated until you have enough participants that are eligible and agree to take part of this study. And it says typically used when problem behavior is illegal or carries social stigma. So for example, we have used this with immigrant population because sometimes it is a hard to reach population because they are afraid of coming out of the shadows, especially those who are undocumented. It would be also likely, for example, sometimes with LGBTQ plus populations or other populations that carry some sort of social stigma. Quota sampling, it begins with estimating the characteristics of the research population regarding selected variables. This description is built into a matrix or table that displays a percentage of people in the population believed to share each combination of characteristics. So in proportional quota sampling, people are selected for study until the correct proportion of cases have the characteristics described within each cell of the matrix. In non-proportional quota sampling, the minimum number of cases required for each category or combination of characteristic is determined, and sampling continues until the minimums are attained. So this would be a good sampling technique if you say, well, we want to have 50 male, 50 female, 50 white, 50 black. So you want to have a specific percentage of people from different characteristics. And I just wanted to point out also that one of the drawbacks of convenience sample is related to cultural sensitivity, and that it may cause a lot of bias. So depending on who is the most accessible to you, your sample may be biased because you may have only certain people from a certain population, such as, for example, African American individuals who are poor and disadvantaged, and who receive public assistance. So your sample might be biased, and it would also be difficult to replicate your study. So these are also things that you need to take into consideration when selecting a sampling technique. Well, thank you so much. I hope you have a great rest of the week.